The Cascade Mountains were not designed for comfort. They rose from the Washington wilderness like the broken teeth of some ancient god, jagged peaks cutting through low clouds that moved with the slow inevitability of glaciers. At 8,400 feet, the air grew thin enough to make breath visible, cold enough to turn that breath to ice crystals before it could dissipate. This was where men came to prove themselves, and where most men learned the difference between confidence and competence. Delta Force Selection, Sniper Division, had claimed this particular stretch of granite and pine for 7 years running. They called themselves the Iron Wolves, though that name never appeared in any official documentation. 8 men, the finest long-range marksmen the United States military could produce, maintained a training facility that existed on no map and operated under protocols that would never be declassified. Their mission was threefold: test new recruits, maintain operational readiness, and protect a record that had become something close to sacred. 2,960 meters. That number represented more than distance. It represented 7 years of dominance, of perfection, of a standard that separated the Iron Wolves from every other sniper unit in the armed forces. The shot had been made by Thomas Brennan, call sign Grizzly, a 67-year-old legend who moved through these mountains like he'd been born from the stone itself. His record stood not just as a measurement of skill, but as a challenge, a line drawn in the snow that whispered to every sniper who came after, "Match this, if you can." No one had. The morning of January 14th arrived with a particular cruelty that only high-altitude winter could deliver. Temperature hung at -15°C, cold enough that rifle bolts needed to be cycled carefully to prevent the lubricant from seizing. Wind came in gusts that peaked at 40 miles per hour, strong enough to push a bullet 18 inches off course at 1,000 meters. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the valleys, deeper in the drifts, creating a landscape of white punctuated only by the dark verticals of pine trees and the darker verticals of men in winter combat gear. Colonel Marcus Vaughn stood at the edge of the range, a thermos of coffee in his gloved hands, watching his team prepare for the day's qualification drill. At 58, he carried the kind of weathered authority that came from 3 decades of putting men in harm's way and bringing most of them home. His beard, trimmed to military precision, had gone silver years ago. His eyes, pale blue and perpetually squinted against wind and sun, missed nothing. The Iron Wolves were running through their pre-shot rituals with the synchronized precision of men who had performed these same actions thousands of times. Lieutenant Garrett Morrison, 34, arrogant in the way that exceptional skill sometimes permitted, was arguing with Werner Steele about wind calculations. Thaddeus Blackwell, senior by age and temperament at 39, cleaned his rifle with movements so practiced they looked like prayer. Rowan Caldwell, youngest of the regulars at 32, checked and rechecked his ammunition, nervous energy manifesting in unnecessary preparation. Callum Frost, 29 and newly rotated into the unit, stood perimeter watch with the intensity of someone still proving himself. Beaumont Shaw, at 37, sat cleaning his scope with the casual confidence of a man who had made difficult shots so many times they had become routine. They were good. Vaughn knew this. He had trained most of them personally, had watched them evolve from competent to exceptional to elite. But excellence, he had learned over 3 decades, was not a destination. It was a standard that had to be defended daily against the slow erosion of complacency, age, and the simple mathematical reality that somewhere, always, someone better was being born. The target waited at 3,001 meters, 41 meters beyond Grizzly's record, a symbolic distance chosen specifically to remind everyone present that records existed to be broken, that the Iron Wolves maintained their dominance only through constant challenge. The target itself was a reinforced steel plate, 2 feet square, painted white to blend with the snow, except for a red circle at its center. At that distance through a high-powered scope, the entire plate would appear no larger than a dime held at arm's length. Vaughn checked his watch. 06:15. The new recruit was late. Sir, Morrison appeared at his elbow, rifle slung across his chest. Recruit hasn't shown. Should I radio base? Vaughn shook his head. Give it 5 minutes. With respect, Colonel, punctuality is... I'm aware what punctuality is, Lieutenant. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded and stepped back. The man had skill that bordered on genius, but his pride was a liability. Vaughn made a mental note to address it, then forgot the note entirely because she was walking out of the fog. No vehicle sound had announced her. No radio chatter had preceded her arrival. She simply emerged from the low clouds that clung to the mountain's eastern slope, a figure in dust-colored combat gear that made her almost invisible until she was 20 meters from the range. She moved with a kind of efficiency that suggested every motion had been calculated for minimum energy expenditure, maximum effect. Her rifle, strapped across her back, looked absurdly large against her frame. The Iron Wolves noticed her in sequence. First Shaw, whose position gave him the widest field of view. Then Steele, who stopped mid-sentence in his argument with Morrison. Then the rest, conversation dying like embers doused with snow. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, though her face carried a stillness that added years. She stood maybe 5'6", perhaps 120 pounds if the combat gear was included in that estimate. Her hair, dark brown and tied back with the kind of severe practicality that spoke to function over form, was already dusted with fresh snow. But it was her eyes that made Vaughn's breath catch in his throat. He knew those eyes, had seen them 19 years ago, looking at him with absolute trust from a 9-year-old face as he taught her father's daughter how to read a topographical map. Had seen them again in photographs, in mission briefings that were classified beyond even his security clearance. Had seen them in his nightmares, after the mission to Hindu Kush went silent and Ghost 7 stopped transmitting and 8 operators were declared lost to an avalanche that Vaughn knew had never occurred. She stopped 10 feet from him and came to attention. Not the exaggerated posture of a recruit trying to impress, but the economical stance of someone who had stood at attention so many times that the position was simply her body's default state. Colonel Vaughn. Her voice was quieter than he expected, but it carried perfectly in the thin mountain air. Reporting as ordered. You're late, he said, because he needed to say something, needed to fill the moment while he processed the impossibility of her presence here. No, sir, the slightest pause. Everyone else arrived at dawn. I arrived exactly when I meant to. It was not disrespect, it was simply truth, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who calculated every variable, including arrival time, and executed according to plan. The distinction irritated Morrison, who stepped forward. Cute, the lieutenant said. You have a name, or should we just call you Tardy? She turned her gaze to him, and Vaughn watched Morrison's smirk falter under that examination. Sarah Cole. The name fell into silence. Werner Steele inhaled sharply. Thaddeus Blackwell's eyes narrowed. Morrison glanced at Vaughn, then back to the woman, confusion and suspicion warring across his face. Cole? Morrison said. As in General William Cole? I wouldn't know, sir. Sarah's expression didn't change. It's a common name. It was not a common name, not in these circles. General William Cole was a ghost story that operators told in the dark, a legend carved from Afghanistan and Iraq and a dozen black sites that would never be acknowledged. The man had been one of the finest snipers in modern warfare, an instructor who had trained half the elite marksmen currently operating in special forces. He had also been declared killed in action 6 years ago, died in circumstances so classified that even his death remained uncertain. And this woman, standing in the snow with her rifle and her steady eyes, was either the world's most unfortunate coincidence or exactly who Vaughn suspected she was. Relation? Vaughn asked quietly. No, sir. The lie was smooth, practiced. Vaughn let it stand. Everyone had ghosts in these mountains. Everyone had reasons for the walls they built. Unload your gear, he said. "You have 1 hour to sight in. After that, qualification begins." Sarah nodded once and moved past them toward the equipment area. The Iron Wolves watched her go with expressions that ranged from skeptical to hostile. Morrison waited until she was out of earshot before leaning close to Vaughn. "Sir, with respect, she's what? 120 soaking wet? That rifle she's carrying is a TAC-50, weighs 29 pounds unloaded. The recoil alone will... The recoil will be her problem, not yours." Vaughn's voice carried the kind of finality that ended conversations. "Everyone qualifies the same. She makes the shot, she's in. She doesn't, she's out. Same as everyone else." But even as he said it, Vaughn knew it was not the same. Could not be the same. Because if this woman was who he thought she was, then her presence here was not coincidence. It was either protection or trap, and he had less than an hour to determine which. Sarah found a position at the far left of the firing line, a lane that no one had claimed because everyone who knew this range knew that lane was cursed. The ground sloped at an awkward angle. The wind came through a gap in the ridgeline that created unpredictable turbulence. The sightline required compensating for a 12-degree elevation change that played hell with ballistic calculations. It was, in every measurable way, the worst possible position from which to attempt a 3,000-meter shot. She chose it deliberately. "Hey, rookie," Caldwell called out to her, his North Georgia accent thick. "Wrong lane. That one's where careers go to die." Another voice, Shaw's New England drawl, added, "Seriously, that position's cursed. No one's made qual from that spot in 3 years." Sarah set her rifle case down and opened it with movements that suggested she had performed this action 10,000 times. The Macmillan TAC-50 lay in custom foam, its extended carbon fiber barrel and custom bolt immediately marking it as something beyond standard military issue. She lifted it out with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Appreciate the advice," she said, not looking up from her weapon. "But I'll stay here." Laughter followed. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive in the way men laughed when they thought they were watching someone make a preventable mistake. Morrison walked over, ostensibly to check the lane markers, actually to get a closer look at her setup. "That rifle," he said, crouching beside her as she extended the bipod, "is modified. Custom barrel, what is that, free-floating?" "Yes, sir." "Custom bolt, too. Schmidt and Bender scope, military grade. That's a $40,000 rifle." $43,000. Sarah adjusted the bipod legs with minute precision, including the optic modifications. Morrison whistled low. "Daddy's money?" Sarah's hands paused for perhaps half a second, then resumed their work. "Something like that." "Well, Daddy's money won't help you with that wind." Morrison stood, brushing snow from his knee. "Good luck, Cole. You're going to need it." He walked away, already dismissing her, already planning how he would describe this moment to the others later. The rich girl with the expensive toy who thought equipment could replace skill. Sarah watched him go with eyes that revealed nothing, then returned her attention to the rifle. The Iron Wolves had their mathematics, their wind meters, their ballistic computers. Sarah had something older, something that her father had taught her when she was 14 years old and learning to shoot on a range in Virginia that also did not appear on any map. She watched the trees. 400 meters downrange, a cluster of pines swayed in the wind. The motion was not uniform. The top branches moved first, catching the initial gust. The middle branches followed 2 seconds later. The lowest branches, protected by the bulk above, barely moved at all. This told her the wind was layered, that it came in waves rather than steady pressure, that the bullet would encounter 3 distinct velocities as it traveled through the first quarter of its flight. At 800 meters, another tree cluster showed different movement. These pines bent more severely, their tops describing arcs that suggested gusts hitting 45 miles per hour. But the rhythm was regular, predictable. 12 seconds between major gusts, 4 seconds of relative calm between them. At 1,200 meters, where the terrain dropped away into a small valley, she could see snow devils dancing across the exposed slope. They spiraled clockwise, driven by the mountain's geography, telling her that the wind at that altitude would push left to right from her perspective. No wind meter could tell her these things. No computer could integrate them into a single firing solution. This required something that technology could not replicate: the ability to see the landscape not as terrain, but as a living system, breathing and moving according to laws that were more art than science. Her father's voice, unbidden, rose from memory. "The mountain speaks to those who listen, Sarah. Learn its language, and you'll never miss." She had not heard his actual voice in 3 years, not since the night Ghost 7 went silent, and she had crawled out of a ravine in the Hindu Kush with frostbite and 3 bullet grazes, and the knowledge that everyone she had served with was dead. For 3 years she had run, had hidden, had existed as a ghost herself, because ghosts were harder to kill than women with names and faces and histories. But you could not run forever. Eventually the mountain found you. Eventually you had to stop and turn and face what was hunting you. And if you were very lucky, very skilled, and very cold, you killed it before it killed you. Colonel Vaughn's voice cut across the range. "Shooters, you have 15 minutes to complete sight-in. After that, qualification begins. 3 shots, 3,001 meters, center mass on target. Questions?" No one spoke. This was not the kind of moment that invited questions. Sarah stretched out behind her rifle, settling into a prone position that took 30 seconds to perfect. Her left hand found the forestock, supporting the weapon's weight without gripping so tight that she transmitted tremor to the barrel. Her right hand curled around the grip, trigger finger extended along the receiver until the moment came to move it. Her cheek pressed against the stock with pressure that was firm but not forced. Her right leg extended straight back, her left leg cocked at the knee, angled outward to stabilize her torso against the uneven ground. Through the scope, the world narrowed to a circle of magnified reality. At 25 times magnification, she could see the steel target plate clearly despite the distance. Could see the red circle at its center, roughly 8 inches in diameter. Could see the way heat waves rose from the snow around it, creating mirage that would affect her point of impact by fractions of an inch that would translate to feet at this range. She cycled the bolt, chambering a .50 BMG round that weighed 750 grains and would leave the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. At 3,000 meters, the bullet would be in the air for 11.2 seconds. In that time, it would drop 173 feet. The wind would push it left or right by anywhere from 12 to 30 inches, depending on conditions. The Earth's rotation would contribute 8.4 inches of drift to the right, a phenomenon called Coriolis effect that most shooters never experienced because most shooters never attempted shots at this distance. Mathematics could account for all of this. Given enough data, a computer could calculate a firing solution accurate to within a few inches. But mathematics assumed stable conditions. Mathematics assumed you could measure every variable. And at 3,000 meters, through mountain wind and changing thermals, and air so thin that density calculations became approximations rather than certainties, mathematics became prayer, and prayer became instinct, and instinct became the only thing that separated a hit from a miss. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the wind on her face. It came from the northwest, carrying the smell of pine and snow and something else, something that tasted like metal and made the hair on her arm stand up despite the layers of thermal gear. A storm was coming, not today, but soon. The air held that particular tension that preceded violence. She opened her eyes and made her calculations, not with numbers but with sensation. The wind would push left. The altitude would increase drop. The cold would slow the bullet by perhaps 20 feet per second. She would need to hold high and right, trusting not mathematics, but the 3-year accumulation of shots taken in mountains like this. In conditions like this, against targets that had occasionally shot back. Colonel Vaughn raised his hand. Shooters ready. 8 rifles stilled. 8 breathing patterns synchronized, slowed, became the controlled respiration of men preparing to send metal across distances that made the very attempt seem arrogant. Fire! The range erupted in thunder. Morrison shot first, his rifle barked sharp and clean. Through her peripheral vision, Sarah saw him maintain his position, watching through his scope for impact. 11 seconds later, his bullet struck snow 3 feet left of the target, throwing up a white plume that was visible even without magnification. Warner Steele fired second. His shot was closer, hitting within a foot of the target's edge. Good shooting for the conditions. Not good enough. Thaddeus Blackwell, the senior sniper, took his time. His shot came 15 seconds after the command, timed to coincide with a lull in the wind that Sarah had also noticed. His bullet struck the steel plate 6 inches from center, producing a ringing impact that echoed across the valley. The Iron Wolves relaxed fractionally. Their standard had been met. Honor was maintained. Then Rowan Caldwell missed entirely, his bullet disappearing into the snowfield beyond the target. Then Beaumont Shaw clipped the edge, close but not centered. Callum Frost, eager to prove himself, rushed his shot and missed by 2 feet. Colonel Vaughn's eyes moved to Sarah's position. Cole, your shot. The other snipers leaned back from their rifles, ready to watch the rookie fail, ready to offer the kind of supportive mockery that would ease her out of the selection process without making it personal. Morrison was already composing his quip, something about expensive rifles in basic skills. Sarah settled deeper into her position. Her heart rate, which had climbed to 72 beats per minute during the wait, began to drop. She breathed in through her nose, 4 counts, filling her lungs from the diaphragm up. Held for 2 counts. Exhaled through barely parted lips for 6 counts, emptying completely. Again and again, until her heart rate touched 64 and the world took on the crystalline clarity that came with absolute focus. The wind was dropping. She could feel it in the way the air pressure changed against her exposed cheek, in the way the sound of distant pine branches faded from constant rustle to intermittent whisper. A lull was coming. A window of perhaps 5 seconds when conditions would be as stable as they would ever be. Through the scope, she watched the mirage patterns above the target. They rippled left to right, confirming wind direction. But the ripples were slowing, the waves lengthening, telling her what the skin on her face already knew. The gust was ending. The lull was beginning. Her father's voice, distant now, but still audible in the part of her mind where memory lived. When the mountain gives you a gift, Sarah, you don't hesitate. You don't second guess. You accept and you execute. The crosshair settled 3 feet above the target and 2 feet to the right. An absurd hold, one that would make no sense to anyone watching through a spotting scope. But Sarah was not aiming where the target was. She was aiming where her bullet would be when it arrived, and those were 2 very different locations. Her finger moved from the receiver to the trigger, found the familiar curve of metal, cold even through her glove. Applied 3.5 pounds of steady pressure. The TAC-50 roared. Recoil drove back against her shoulder with force that would have been painful if she had not been properly positioned. The rifle rose, came back down, settled. Sarah stayed in her scope, watching, counting. 1001, 1002, 1003. The wind picked up again, 3 seconds too late to effect her shot. 1007, 1008, 1009. Through the scope, she could not see the bullet, could not track its arc, could only watch the target and trust that 30 years of combined training between her and her father had produced the correct solution. 1011. The steel plate rang like a bell struck by lightning, dead center. The red circle at the target's heart showed a bright silver impact point, where paint had been blown away by the .50 caliber round. At 3,001 meters, through mountain wind and thin air and against every reasonable expectation, Sarah Cole had placed her first shot exactly where she had intended it to go. The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison's mouth hung open. Warner Steele had gone perfectly still, his hands frozen on his spotting scope. Even Thaddeus Blackwell, who had seen nearly 50 years of exceptional shooting, stared at the target with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering fundamental assumptions about probability and skill. Colonel Vaughn's face revealed nothing, but his right hand had unconsciously formed into a fist. "Beginner's luck," someone muttered. Sarah did not look to see who. She was already cycling her bolt, chambering a second round, returning to her position. "Cole," Vaughn's voice carried across the range. "Second shot." She did not acknowledge with words, did not need to. Her body language, the way she settled back into the rifle, communicated everything necessary. She was ready, she was confident, and she was going to do it again. This time she did not close her eyes to feel the wind, did not need to. The first shot had confirmed what her instincts had told her. The language of stone and wind and snow was clear today. She made no adjustments to her hold, no changes to her breathing pattern. The conditions were identical. The solution was identical. The only variable was doubt, and Sarah had spent 3 years in the wilderness learning to kill doubt before it killed her. She fired. 11.3 seconds later, the target rang again. Same impact point, perhaps 2 inches from the first hole. At this distance, that grouping suggested not luck, but mastery. Not accident, but absolute control of variables that should have been uncontrollable. The Iron Wolves were not laughing now. They were not offering supportive mockery or gentle criticism. They were staring at this small woman with her expensive rifle and her impossible shots, and they were experiencing the particular discomfort of men who had believed themselves to be the best, suddenly confronting the possibility that they were merely very good. Morrison stood up from his position. No, that's not possible. Wind changed between shots. Had to have changed." "It did," Thaddeus Blackwell said quietly. The senior sniper had not moved from his spotting scope. Picked up about 4 miles per hour after her first shot, dropped back to baseline before her second. "Then how did she—" "She waited." Grizzly's voice entered the conversation for the first time that morning. The old man had been observing from the sidelines, his weathered face impassive. "She timed the lull, read the wind patterns and waited for the window. That's not luck, Lieutenant. That's mastery." Vaughn stepped forward. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something that might have been respect, or might have been concern, or might have been both. "Third shot, Cole." Sarah's finger rested on the trigger. She had proven what needed to be proven, had demonstrated that her presence here was not charity, not nepotism, not the result of anyone's misplaced faith. She belonged here, on this range, attempting this shot. The record was no longer theoretical. It was sitting in her crosshair, waiting to be broken. She thought of her father, wherever he was, whatever mission kept him so deep in the black that even his death had been faked. Wondered if he somehow knew she was here, knew she was attempting this. Wondered if he would be proud, or if he would be terrified that she had stopped running long enough for the people hunting her to find her. 3 years ago, in a ravine in the Hindu Kush, she had made a promise to the men whose bodies she had left behind, had sworn that she would not die quietly, would not disappear into obscurity, would not let the massacre of Ghost 7 be the final word on their service. She would become so skilled, so visible, so undeniably excellent that someone would eventually ask questions about how a woman this good had appeared from nowhere, would trace her back to that unit, that mission, that night when 12 mercenaries had executed 8 operators and left her for dead. This shot was not about records. It was about resurrection. It was about transforming from ghost to legend, because legends were harder to kill than ghosts. She fired. The bullet flew true. 3 shots, 3 hits, all within an 8-inch circle at 3,001 meters. 7 years of Iron Wolf's dominance ended in the time it took for 34 seconds of bullet flight. Sarah lifted her head from the scope, cycled the bolt to clear the chamber, and engaged the safety with movements so practiced they appeared choreographed. She stood, dusted snow from her knees, and slung the TAC-50 over her shoulder with the same ease someone might handle a violin. Without looking at the stunned faces around her, without acknowledging the silence that had replaced the earlier mockery, she walked toward Colonel Vaughn and stopped at a position of attention. "You asked for a sniper, sir." Her voice was steady, empty of pride or satisfaction, or anything except simple statement of fact. "I'm here." For 5 full seconds, Vaughn did not respond, could not respond because he was processing implications that extended far beyond marksmanship scores and qualification standards. If this woman was Sarah Cole, daughter of William Cole, last survivor of Ghost 7, then her presence here meant someone in the black world had made a decision, had decided she was either an asset worth protecting or a liability that needed to be contained where she could be monitored. And if Victor Krieg and his Black Ridge mercenaries had found Ghost 7 once, they could find her again. "Welcome to the Iron Wolves," Vaughn said finally, his voice carrying across the range so every man present would hear. "Report to supply for gear assignment. You're bunking in the auxiliary structure, solo quarters." Sarah nodded once and moved toward the supply building. As she walked away, the whispers started. Quiet at first, then building in volume as shock transformed into speculation, speculation into suspicion, suspicion into the kind of resentment that came when excellence arrived without warning and demolished assumptions that men had built careers defending. Morrison approached Vaughn as soon as Sarah was out of earshot. "Sir, something's wrong about this. No one shoots like that. Not on their first day. Not from that lane." "She shot like that because she can shoot like that." Vaughn's tone suggested the conversation was over, but Morrison pushed. "You know something about her, something you're not sharing." Vaughn turned to face the lieutenant directly. "What I know, Morrison, is that she just outshot every man on this range. What I know is that she's qualified, by any standard we've ever applied, to be here. Everything else is speculation, and speculation without evidence is just noise." He walked away before Morrison could respond, pulling his satellite phone from an inside pocket as he moved toward the command tent. The call he needed to make was classified 3 levels above anything the Iron Wolves were cleared for. It would be brief, encrypted, and probably futile, because the people who operated at that level of the black world rarely answered questions, even from colonels. But he had to try. Because if Sarah Cole was being hunted, if the same people who had slaughtered Ghost 7 were tracking her, then the Iron Wolves had just become ground zero for a conflict they did not understand and were not prepared for. The afternoon passed in uncomfortable silence. The Iron Wolves completed their remaining qualifications, though the scores were uniformly lower than usual, focus disrupted by the morning's events. Sarah received her gear assignment, collected cold weather equipment and communications devices, and the various small necessities of life on a remote military installation, and carried everything to the auxiliary structure without requesting help. The building stood 200 meters from the main camp, a deliberate isolation that was standard for new recruits. It gave them space to adjust, prevented them from disrupting unit cohesion before they had proven themselves worthy of inclusion. Usually that isolation lasted a week, sometimes longer if the recruits struggled or the team was particularly insular. For Sarah, the isolation was welcome. She set up her bunk with military precision, stored her gear according to protocols she had learned years ago, and then sat on the edge of the thin mattress with her rifle across her knees and let herself feel, for just a moment, the weight of what she had done. She had broken cover, had announced her presence to anyone watching these mountains. In 3 perfect shots, she had transformed from invisible to undeniable, and undeniable meant targetable. Through the small window, she could see the main camp, could see Morrison gesticulating as he spoke to Werner Steele, could see Thaddeus Blackwell standing alone, staring up at the mountains with the expression of a man contemplating horizons beyond what his eyes could perceive. Could see Colonel Vaughn in the command tent, phone to his ear, face drawn with concern that he was trying to hide from the men under his command. Her father had taught her many things: how to read wind, how to calculate elevation, how to control her breathing until her heart rate dropped to levels that most people only achieved in deep sleep. But the most important lesson had been this: when you stop running, when you finally turn to face what hunts you, you must do so from a position of strength. You must make them come to you on ground you have chosen, at a time you have selected, with advantages you have carefully constructed. These mountains were her ground now. The Iron Wolves, whether they knew it or not, were her advantage. And when Victor Krieg finally came for her, because he would come, she was certain of this, she would be ready. Sarah stood, walked to the window, and looked north toward the ridgeline that separated this valley from the next. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold and orange, and finally deep purple as light bled from the sky. In that failing light, nothing moved. No thermal signatures disturbed the perfect stillness of winter landscape. But something was wrong. She could feel it in the same part of her awareness that felt wind changes and temperature drops. The birds had stopped singing. The small sounds of wildlife moving through underbrush had ceased. She had learned to read the language of stone and wind and snow, and right now that language was speaking a single word: danger. Sarah picked up her rifle, checked that a magazine was seated, that a round was chambered, that the safety was engaged. Then she sat in the chair by the window, weapon across her lap, and watched the darkness come. In the command tent, Vaughn stared at his laptop screen, the encrypted message glowing in the dim light. The transmission had arrived 30 minutes ago, routed through channels that existed outside normal military communications, tagged with priority codes that made his blood run cold. Priority Alpha. Asset Sarah Cole, location compromised. Black Ridge mercenaries activated. Target termination. Authorization unknown. ETA 48 hours. Recommend immediate extraction. Attached was a photograph. Victor Krieg, 45 years old, former Delta Force operator, dishonorably discharged for executing prisoners during a black operation in Yemen. The man had spent the last decade building Black Ridge into the most lethal mercenary unit in the underground world. 12 operators, all former Tier 1, all willing to kill for money without asking questions about why. And according to this message, they were 48 hours away. Vaughn deleted the message, then sat staring at the blank screen. He could extract Sarah tonight, could have her on a helicopter before dawn, relocated to a facility so deep in the bureaucracy that even Black Ridge couldn't find her. But extraction meant revealing that he knew her identity, that he had been protecting her, that this entire training cycle had been a cover operation. It meant burning his career. It meant exposing operations that were classified beyond even his clearance. It meant admitting that the Iron Wolves had been used as bait in a trap that Vaughn himself had not fully understood until this moment. He made his decision. Sarah stayed. But he doubled the perimeter watch, assigned Frost to the northern position with orders to report anything unusual, and began planning defensive positions that could hold against a professional assault. 48 hours. He had 48 hours to turn a training camp into a fortress, to prepare 6 elite snipers for a fight they did not know was coming, and to keep Sarah Cole alive long enough for whoever had sent that message to finish whatever operation required her to be here. Somewhere in that darkness, perhaps already in these mountains, perhaps still approaching, Victor Krieg was planning her death. He was reviewing maps, calculating distances, deploying his 12 operators into positions that would turn this valley into a kill box. But Victor Krieg had never met Sarah Cole, had only fought the terrified survivor who had crawled from a ravine 3 years ago. He did not know what she had become in those 3 years, did not know what 3 years of rage and training and absolute focus could create from a woman who had every reason to die and every reason to live. The mountain had taught her to listen, and tonight, in the growing dark, Sarah Cole was listening very carefully indeed. The first death came quietly. Callum Frost had been standing perimeter watch for 6 hours when the bullet found him. He was 29 years old, engaged to a woman in Portland who taught 3rd grade, father to a daughter he had not yet met because she would not be born for another 4 months. He died thinking about baby names, about whether they should paint the nursery yellow or green, about whether he would survive long enough to teach his child how to ride a bicycle. The .338 Lapua Magnum round entered his skull just above the right temple, traveling at 2,800 feet per second from a distance of 3,200 meters. The bullet fragmented on impact with bone, turning his brain into catastrophic trauma before pain signals could register. He fell forward into the snow without sound, without struggle, without ever knowing that death had been watching him to a thermal scope for the previous 40 minutes. Werner Steele found the body at 0600 during shift change. His scream brought the camp to combat readiness in less than 30 seconds. Men who had been sleeping were suddenly prone behind whatever cover they could find, rifles oriented outward, searching for threats that the darkness and distance made invisible. Colonel Vaughn emerged from the command tent already wearing body armor, sidearm drawn, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had responded to ambushes often enough to make the motions instinctive. Sarah was the first to reach Frost's position. She had not been sleeping, had spent the entire night in her isolated quarters, watching the northern ridgeline with an attention that went beyond vigilance into something closer to prophecy. When Steele's scream cut through the pre-dawn silence, she was already moving, rifle in hand, crossing the 200 meters between her building and the perimeter in a sprint that left boot prints in fresh snow like accusations. She dropped to one knee beside the body and examined it with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen violent death before, who understood that sentiment was a luxury that got people killed. Entry wound above the temple. No exit wound, which meant the bullet had fragmented completely. Kill shot, professional execution, fired from extreme range by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Her face went white, not from the gore, not from the proximity to death, but from recognition. Because she knew this signature, had seen it before, 3 years ago, when men she served with had been picked off one by one across 2 mountains in Afghanistan. This was Black Ridge methodology. This was Victor Krieg announcing his presence the only way he knew how, with precision, with cruelty, with the kind of long-range murder that made survivors feel helpless. Black Ridge, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos of men shouting questions and demanding answers. This is Black Ridge. Morrison, crouched behind a supply crate 15 feet away, turned his head toward her. What the hell is Black Ridge? Sarah stood, scanning the ridgeline to the north, with eyes that searched not for movement, but for the absence of movement, the places where snow patterns had been disturbed by bodies settling into shooting positions. Mercenaries, 12 operators, all former Tier 1. They specialize in mountain warfare and extreme range elimination. Why would mercenaries be here? Thaddeus Blackwell's voice was steady, but his hands had tightened on his rifle. The old sniper had fought in enough wars to recognize when fear was appropriate. Sarah turned to face them, and for the first time since arriving, her careful mask of control showed cracks. Because they're here for me. The admission hung in the frozen air like something physical, something that could be touched and examined and judged. Morrison stood up from his cover, weapons still ready but now pointed as much at Sarah as at the unknown threat. "Explain," Colonel Vaughn commanded. His voice carried absolute authority. the kind that cut through panic and imposed order by sheer force of will. Right now, Cole, everything. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it, but preparation and execution were different things. Preparation happened in isolation, in the privacy of her own mind. Execution required standing in front of men who did not trust her and admitting truths that would make that distrust worse. 3 years ago, she began, each word precise and empty of emotion. I was part of a unit called Ghost 7, 8 operators, deep reconnaissance in the Hindu Kush Mountains, Afghanistan. Our mission was classified beyond standard special forces protocols. We were hunting what command called an intelligence asset, though they never told us who or what we were actually looking for. She paused, scanning the ridgeline again, knowing that every second she spent explaining was a second that Krieg's people were repositioning, preparing their next shot. We arrived at the coordinates and realized immediately that something was wrong. The terrain was perfect for an ambush. Every approach was exposed. Every position was prearranged. Someone had known we were coming and had prepared the battlefield accordingly. What happened? Vaughn's question was quiet, but it demanded answer. They hit us from 2 mountains, 20 shooters, firing from positions between 1,800 and 3,500 meters. Methodical, professional. They picked us off one by one over the course of 6 hours. I was shot 3 times, all grazes. Fell into a ravine during the 4th hour and was buried by snow. They thought I was dead. Everyone thought I was dead. Morrison lowered his rifle slightly. And these mercenaries, Black Ridge, they're the ones who killed your unit? Yes. Why? Sarah met his eyes directly. Because someone paid them $2 million to do it. And apparently, they've been paid again to finish what they started. The implications settled over the group like avalanche debris, heavy and suffocating. Beaumont Shaw, positioned near the southern perimeter, spoke what everyone was thinking. So we're collateral damage. You brought them here, and now we die for your mistakes. It was not a question. It was an accusation delivered with the cold fury of a man watching his life expectancy drop with every passing second. Shaw. Grizzly's voice carried warning. The old man had moved to join the group, his weathered face grim. Lock it down. Lock it down? Shaw turned, his normally relaxed face twisted with rage. Frost is dead, Grizzly. Dead because she... The second shot interrupted him. The bullet came from a different direction, south instead of north, fired from an estimated 3,400 meters. It struck Shaw on the right shoulder, high enough to miss vital organs but severe enough to spin him completely around and drop him into the snow, screaming. The sound of the shot arrived 3 seconds later, a flat crack that echoed off the mountain walls and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Before anyone could react, a third shot rang out. This one hit Werner Steele, who had been moving to assist Shaw. The bullet grazed his left thigh, not life-threatening, but enough to make him combat ineffective, blood soaking through his tactical pants within seconds as he fell cursing to the ground. Steele's hit, someone shouted. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled for cover, firing blind toward where they thought the shots had originated, wasting ammunition on empty mountainside. Vaughn's voice cut through the panic, ordering ceasefire, ordering discipline, ordering his men to act like the trained professionals they were supposed to be instead of panicked recruits. Sarah did not move toward cover. She stood in the open, rifle raised, scanning through her scope with movements so small they were almost invisible. Her breathing had slowed despite the adrenaline. Her hands were steady despite the immediate threat. She was not searching for the shooters who had hit Shaw and Steele. Those shooters would already be relocating, would already be 400 meters from their firing positions, moving to the next pre-planned hide. She was searching for the pattern. 3 shots, 2 different directions, both from extreme range. This was not about efficient killing. If Krieg wanted them all dead, he would have used explosives, would have hit the command tent or the fuel depot, would have created casualties that could not be treated in the field. Instead, he was bleeding them. One man dead, two men wounded, and everyone terrified, trapped, uncertain where the next shot would come from. This was psychological warfare. This was Krieg's signature. Break them mentally before breaking them physically. Make them understand that safety was an illusion, that distance was no protection, that death could reach out and touch them from mountains so far away that return fire was mathematically impossible. Through her scope, Sarah tracked the bullet's trajectory backward, calculating the firing position. South-southwest, approximately 3,400 meters. But something was wrong. That position was exposed, tactically unsound for a professional shooter. Then she saw it, a second thermal signature, 500 meters behind the first. The shooter who hit Shaw was a decoy. The real threat was the spotter behind him, already relocating. Blackridge wasn't just attacking. They were teaching the Iron Wolves that nowhere was safe, that every assumed threat could be misdirection. "They're playing chess," she muttered, "and we're still learning checkers." Sarah lowered her rifle and sprinted toward the command tent. Morrison shouted after her, something about staying in cover, but she ignored him. She reached Vaughn's position and spoke rapidly, her voice low enough that only the colonel could hear. "He's playing with us. Multiple shooters, maybe 5 or 6, all positioned at ranges we can't match with standard equipment. They're trying to pin us here, wait for dark, then close for the kill." Vaughn's face was stone. "Recommendations? We fortify. We wait for the storm. There's one coming, I can feel it. And we extract under weather cover. But sir, you need to understand something." She paused, making certain he was listening. "They're not here to wipe out the Iron Wolves. They're here to isolate me. The kills are tactical, not strategic. Krieg wants me to watch you die, one by one, until I either break or surrender. You seem very certain about his methodology." "I spent 6 hours listening to him execute my friends." Sarah's voice did not waver. "I know exactly how he thinks." Before Vaughn could respond, Morrison appeared at the tent entrance. His face was flushed with exertion and fury. "Colonel, I need to speak with you, privately." "Speak." Morrison glanced at Sarah, then back to Vaughn. "Sir, I checked the communication logs. 2 days ago I made a call, personal call, to my girlfriend at base. I mentioned—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I mentioned we had a new recruit, female sniper, Cascade training site." The silence that followed was absolute. "The call was unsecured," Morrison continued, his voice barely above whisper. "Standard frequency. If they were monitoring military bands, if they had signal intelligence capability, they would have triangulated your location and identified the recruit." Vaughn finished the sentence with the kind of cold precision that made grown men flinch. "You compromised operational security, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir." "Frost is dead because you couldn't follow basic protocol." "Yes, sir." "Shaw and Steele are bleeding in the snow because you needed to call your girlfriend." Morrison's face had gone gray. "Sir, I didn't know. I didn't think." "You didn't think." Vaughn's voice could have etched steel. "And now we're in a combat situation against an enemy force we can't see, can't range, and can't escape from. Because you didn't think." Sarah stepped between them before Vaughn could continue. "Sir, with respect, blame can wait. Survival can't. We need defensive positions now. We need to account for all personnel, and we need to assume they have eyes on us from multiple positions." Vaughn stared at her for 3 seconds that felt like minutes, then nodded. "Agreed. Morrison, you're on Shaw and Steele. Get them stabilized. Get them inside. Blackwell, Caldwell, I want fighting positions established on the north and south perimeters. Overlapping fields of fire, overhead cover where possible. Cole." "I want the western outcrop," Sarah interrupted. 400 meters from camp, elevated position, clear sight lines to probable enemy locations." "That position is completely exposed." "Yes, sir. which means they won't expect anyone to be stupid enough to occupy it. Vaughn studied her face, searching for doubt or bravado or death wish. Found only cold calculation. You're volunteering to be bait. I'm volunteering to be in a position where I can see them before they see me. There's a difference. And if they range your position, if they decide you're a priority target, Sarah's smile was small and contained no humor whatsoever. Then they'll learn that some targets shoot back. The afternoon passed in tense preparation. The Iron Wolves, reduced from 8 combat-effective personnel to 5, with Frost dead and Shaw Steele wounded, established defensive positions that turned the camp into something resembling a fortress. Sandbags appeared from supply containers. Firing lanes were cleared. Overhead netting, designed to break up thermal signatures, was strung between structures. Every man moved with the heightened awareness of soldiers who understood that the next second might be their last. Sarah worked alone, hauling equipment to the western outcrop, despite offers of help that were really just Morrison's guilt-seeking expression. She wanted to be alone, needed the physical labor, the burn in her shoulders and legs, the simple mechanical process of moving weight from one location to another. It kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something other than the faces of the men she had left behind 3 years ago. The outcrop was exactly as exposed as Vaughn had suggested. A tumble of granite that rose 15 feet above the surrounding terrain. It offered excellent visibility and almost no cover. Snow had drifted against the northern face, creating a natural hide that Sarah improved with careful excavation. By the time she finished, she had a prone position that allowed her to see 3 valleys and 4 ridgelines, while presenting a profile no larger than a medium-sized rock. She settled in with her rifle, her spare ammunition, and a thermos of coffee that would be cold within the hour, but would serve its purpose of keeping her awake. Through her scope, she began the methodical process of scanning every possible shooting position within 4,000 meters. This was the part of sniping that movies never showed, that civilians never understood. The hours of watching, the endless scanning, the patient cataloging of every rock formation, every tree cluster, every terrain feature that might hide a man with a rifle. It was boring work, eye-straining work, the kind of work that separated professionals from amateurs. Sarah had been doing this work since she was 16 years old. Her father had trained her on principles that were older than modern armies, older than gunpowder. A sniper, he had told her while they lay in a Virginia field watching deer move through distant trees, is not someone who shoots well. Anyone can shoot well with enough practice. A sniper is someone who sees what others miss, who notices the bird that didn't fly, the shadow that's wrong, the stillness that's too still. She saw them at 15:30 hours, not the shooters themselves, but the absence they created. On the northwestern ridge, approximately 3,600 meters distant, there was a section of snow that looked wrong, too smooth, too perfect. Natural snow, shaped by wind, created patterns. This snow had no patterns, which meant someone had smoothed it, had erased the tracks and disturbances created by settling into position. Sarah marked the location mentally, but did not report it. Not yet. One position was not the whole picture. Krieg would have multiple shooters, multiple locations, creating overlapping fields of fire that gave him flexibility and redundancy. She needed to find them all before she revealed that she had found any of them. The sun dropped toward the western peaks, stretching shadows across the valley. Temperature fell with the light, dropping from -15 Celsius to -22. Sarah's fingers began to ache inside her gloves. Her toes went numb despite thermal boots. She ignored both, maintaining her scan pattern with mechanical precision. At 1600 hours, she found the second position. South-southwest, 3,200 meters. Another patch of snow that was too perfect. She marked it, continued scanning. Found the third position at 1620, northeast, 3,900 meters. The fourth at 1645, due north, 3,500 meters. 4 positions, 4 shooters. which meant at least 8 more were somewhere else, probably closer. South-southwest, 3,200. Northeast, 3,900. North, 3,500. All extreme range, all occupied, all with clear sightlines to camp. Silence on the other end while Vaughn processed the implications. Can you range them? The 3,200-meter position, maybe. The others are beyond effective range for anything we have except my rifle. And? Sarah understood what he was really asking. Could she kill them? Could she eliminate 4 professional shooters at distances that made the very attempt seem like suicide? Could she do it before they relocated? Before they realized they had been spotted? Before they killed more of his men? I can make the shots, she said. But the moment I fire, every Black Ridge operator in these mountains will know my position. I'll get 1, maybe 2 before I have to relocate. And if Krieg has spotters positioned to watch for muzzle flash, I'll be drawing accurate return fire within 20 seconds. Unacceptable risk. With respect, sir, Frost, Shaw, and Steele prove that staying passive is also unacceptable risk. More silence. Then Vaughn's voice, harder now, carrying the weight of command decisions that balance lives against mission objectives. Hold position. Do not fire unless given explicit authorization. We extract at 0300 under storm cover. Until then, we minimize exposure and pray they don't get lucky again. Sarah acknowledged and returned to her scope. But even as she maintained her watch, even as she cataloged every detail of the enemy positions, a separate part of her mind was calculating something else entirely. Krieg was out there, not in one of these shooting positions, but somewhere behind them, directing the operation from a command post that would be too far back to be at risk. That was his pattern, his signature. He did not take shots himself anymore. He orchestrated, he commanded. He watched through binoculars and radios while his men did the killing, which meant finding him required not just seeing where his shooters were, but understanding what they were protecting. Where would a commander position himself to maintain line-of-sight communication with 4 positions spread across 3 valleys? Where would he establish an observation post that allowed oversight of the entire battle space while remaining beyond effective engagement range? Her eyes moved to Cathedral Peak. The mountain rose to 9,200 feet, dominating the northwestern skyline. From its summit, a person could see for 50 miles in clear weather, could observe every approach to this valley, could watch the Iron Wolves camp with equipment as simple as civilian binoculars. And the distance from Cathedral Peak to her current position was approximately 4,100 meters. An impossible shot. Beyond the effective range of her weapon, beyond the reasonable limits of ballistic calculations. The kind of shot that existed in theory, but not in practice. In mathematics, but not in reality. Her father had made a 41 80-meter shot in Kandahar, at night in a sandstorm, with wind that shifted unpredictably and visibility that dropped to near zero. He had killed a Taliban commander who was directing an ambush against a convoy, killed him from a distance so extreme that the commander never knew he was being hunted. If William Cole could make that shot, then his daughter could match it. The question was not whether she could make the shot. The question was whether she would survive long enough to take it. Sarah settled deeper into her position and continued her watch. The sun touched the peaks, painting them gold and orange. Temperature continued to drop. Wind began to gust, preliminary turbulence from the storm system she could feel approaching. By midnight, conditions would be terrible. By 0300, when Vaughn planned to extract, visibility would be measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. Unless she changed the equation. Unless she eliminated Krieg before extraction became necessary. At 17:30 hours, her radio crackled again. Different voice this time. Not Vaughn's command authority, but something older, calmer, carrying the weight of 5 decades in uniform. Sarah, Thaddeus Blackwell's voice was barely above a whisper. This is Grizzly. I'm on the eastern perimeter. Can you talk? She keyed her radio twice in acknowledgement, but did not speak. Talking created noise. and noise could travel. I knew your father, Grizzly continued. Served with him in Grenada, trained under him at Benning. Best sniper I ever met, and I've met a few. He taught me that shot I made 3 years ago, the 2960. Took me 11 attempts before I could do it reliably. Took him one. Sarah remained silent, but her grip on the radio had tightened. I recognized you the moment you arrived. You have his eyes. Same color, same focus, same way of seeing through things instead of at them. And when you made those 3 shots this morning, I knew. Knew you weren't just some talented recruit. You're William Cole's daughter, and you shoot like him. And whatever brought you here is something that terrifies a full colonel badly enough that he's been on encrypted calls all day. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked finally, her voice barely audible. Because when this gets bad, and it will get bad, I want you to know that some of us understand. Whatever you're running from, whatever you're fighting, you're not alone. The Iron Wolves protect their own, even the ones who just joined. The transmission ended. Sarah sat in her hide and felt something in her chest that might have been gratitude or might have been grief. She had been alone for so long that the concept of protection, of belonging, of men who would stand with her despite the danger she brought, seemed alien, false, a trick that would reveal itself as illusion once the bullets started flying again. But Grizzly's words had not sounded like a trick. They had sounded like a promise. The sun dropped below the peaks. Darkness came rapidly at this altitude, erasing the landscape in stages. First the valleys filled with shadow, then the lower slopes. Then the ridgelines themselves disappeared until only the peaks remained, glowing with the last reflected light before they too surrendered to night. Sarah switched her optic to thermal mode. The world transformed into shades of white and gray and black, heat signatures standing out against the cold background like stars against void. She could see the camp below and to the east, bright blooms of warmth marking the locations of men and equipment. Could see the enemy positions on the ridgelines, fainter but present, revealing themselves through body heat that no amount of camouflage could completely mask. And on Cathedral Peak, barely visible even in thermal, a single signature sat absolutely motionless. Sarah adjusted her scope's magnification to maximum. The figure resolved slowly, details emerging from pixelation. Man-sized, heavy cold weather gear, something that might be binoculars or might be a spotting scope. Positioned at the summit, unmoving, observing. Victor Krieg, announcing his presence the same way he had announced it 3 years ago, by watching, by waiting, by letting his targets know they were being hunted without giving them any chance to do anything about it. Sarah's radio crackled. Different frequency this time, one she had not been monitoring because it was not part of the Iron Wolves' communications plan. The voice that emerged was cultured, educated, empty of emotion. Sarah Cole, I know you're listening. I know you found my positions. You were always good at finding things that wanted to stay hidden. She did not respond, did not acknowledge, but her finger moved to her radio, changing frequencies, searching for the source. Your father sends his regards, Krieg continued. Did you know he's alive? Of course you didn't. How could you? He's been deep black for 6 years, hunting ghosts in places that don't exist. But he contacted me 3 months ago, offered me $4 million to complete what Ghost 7 started, offered me double my original fee to correct his mistake. The words hit like physical blows. Oh, you thought Ghost 7 was a real mission? Krieg laughed, a sound like ice cracking. Sarah, it was house cleaning. Your father needed certain information buried, certain people silenced. Ghost 7 had that information, so he hired me to eliminate the unit, stage it as enemy action, and move on. You were never supposed to survive. You were collateral damage that crawled out of a ravine and ruined a perfectly executed operation. Sarah's breathing had stopped. Her vision had narrowed. Every instinct screamed that this was a lie, that Krieg was doing what he always did, breaking people psychologically before killing them physically. But doubt, once seated, grew like infection. "He's watching right now," Krieg said, "from a command center in Virginia. Satellite feed, real time. Waiting to see if I finally finish the job he paid me to do. Waiting to see his daughter die and his problems disappear. Ask yourself, Sarah, why haven't you heard from him in 3 years? Why hasn't he reached out, checked if you survived, offered protection? Because he knows you survived, and he's been hunting you ever since." The transmission ended. Sarah sat motionless in her hide, rifle across her knees, staring at nothing. Silence pressed down like physical weight. Even the wind had stilled, as if the world itself was waiting to see what she would do with Krieg's revelation. In the camp below, Morrison was trying to stabilize Shaw's shoulder wound with supplies that were inadequate for the damage. Steele lay on a cot, his leg bandaged, face pale from blood loss, but stable. Grizzly stood watch on the eastern perimeter, old eyes scanning darkness for threats that could kill from distances that made defense impossible. Vaughn was in the command tent, staring at maps and casualty reports and trying to calculate odds that got worse with every passing hour. And on Cathedral Peak, 4,100 meters away, Victor Krieg watched through his binoculars and waited for Sarah Cole to break. She keyed her radio, Vaughn's frequency. Her voice was steady, empty, the voice of someone who had just stepped past fear into something colder. "Colonel, change of plans. I'm going hunting." Colonel Vaughn's response came through the radio with the sharp edge of command authority that expected immediate compliance. "Negative, Cole. You hold position. That is a direct order." Sarah keyed her radio once in acknowledgement, but did not move from her prone position. She was not refusing the order, not exactly. She was simply allowing the colonel to believe she would follow it while her mind worked through calculations that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with survival. Krieg's words circled in her consciousness like carrion birds. "Your father hired me. You were collateral damage. He's been hunting you ever since." Lies. They had to be lies. Psychological warfare designed to break her focus, to make her doubt, to transform her from predator to prey through nothing more than carefully chosen words transmitted across encrypted frequencies. But what if they were not lies? What if her father, the man who had taught her to shoot, to think, to survive, had decided that his daughter was a liability? What if Ghost 7 had stumbled onto something so classified that even family became acceptable casualties? The black world operated on mathematics that had no space for sentiment. Missions were calculated in cost-benefit analyses where human lives were variables to be optimized. If eliminating 8 operators saved a larger operation, then 8 operators died. That was not cruelty, that was pragmatism, and William Cole had always been exceptionally pragmatic. Sarah forced the thoughts away. Later. She could process betrayal later, could examine the architecture of her father's choices after she survived the immediate threat. Right now, Krieg was on Cathedral Peak with binoculars and communications equipment, directing 12 shooters who had already killed Frost and wounded Shaw and Steele. Right now, the Iron Wolves were pinned in a valley with diminishing options and approaching darkness. Right now, survival required action, not contemplation. She studied Cathedral Peak through her thermal scope. The single heat signature remained motionless at the summit, occasionally shifting position in ways that suggested scanning, observing, commanding. The distance was 4,100 meters, an impossible shot by any reasonable standard. Wind was gusting to 50 miles per hour. Temperature had dropped to -28 Celsius. Visibility was decreasing as the storm system approached, clouds moving in from the northwest with the ponderous inevitability of geological forces. Her father's voice rising from memory unbidden. "When faced with impossible odds, Sarah, you change the equation. You don't fight fair. You don't accept the enemy's framework. You create your own advantages and you exploit them without mercy." The advantage here was that Krieg believed her broken, believed his revelation about her father had shattered her psychologically. He would be watching for collapse, for surrender, for the signature behaviors of someone whose world had just inverted. He would not be watching for aggression, would not expect her to attempt something so tactically insane that it transcended into genius. Sarah began to move, not back toward camp, not into the defensive perimeter where Vaughn expected her. Instead, she moved north, parallel to the ridgeline, staying low in the terrain folds where thermal signatures would be masked by cold rock and residual snow. She carried only essentials: her TAC-50 rifle, 3 magazines of ammunition, her sidearm, a radio, and a thermos of water that would freeze within the hour but would serve its purpose until then. The movement was glacially slow, 10 meters every 5 minutes, pausing between each advance to scan for enemy positions, to verify that no one had noticed her displacement. The Black Ridge shooters were focused on the camp, on the obvious targets illuminated by generator lights and body heat. They were not watching for someone stupid enough to leave the relative safety of defensive positions and move into the open darkness. After 40 minutes, she had covered 600 meters. After 90 minutes, she had reached the base of the northern ridgeline, where the terrain began its steep climb toward Cathedral Peak. Her legs burned from the low crawl. Her elbows were bruised from dragging herself across frozen ground. Her breathing came in controlled gasps that turned to ice crystals in the negative temperature. She allowed herself 2 minutes of rest, then began to climb. The ascent to Cathedral Peak was technically classified as a scramble rather than a climb, requiring hands and feet but not ropes or specialized equipment. In daylight, in summer, it was a 4-hour hike that drew occasional mountaineers seeking the summit view. In darkness, in winter, in combat conditions, it became something else entirely. Sarah moved from handhold to handhold, testing each grip before committing her weight, knowing that a fall here would mean broken bones at minimum, death at worst, and mission failure regardless. At 2,200 hours, she was halfway up. At 2,300, she had covered 3/4 of the distance. The wind had increased to steady gusts that threatened to tear her from the mountain face. Snow had begun to fall, light flurries that would become heavy accumulation within the hour. Her hands were numb inside her gloves. Her face felt like frozen leather stretched too tight over bone. She kept climbing. At 23:45 hours, she reached a shelf 200 meters below the summit. Here the terrain flattened enough to provide stable shooting position. More importantly, it was the only location that offered both cover from the wind and clear line of sight to where Krieg had positioned himself. Sarah settled into the space between 2 granite formations, checked her rifle, and began the process of preparing for a shot that would define the rest of her life. Assuming she survived the next 15 minutes, through her scope she could see the summit clearly, despite the darkness and falling snow. The thermal signature was still there, still motionless, still watching the valley below. Range: 4,187 meters, 2.61 miles. A distance so extreme that the bullet would be in flight for nearly 16 seconds, subject to wind drift that could measure in feet rather than inches, affected by Coriolis force and spin drift, and a dozen other variables that transform ballistic calculations from science into prayer. Sarah's radio crackled. Vaughn's voice, tight with barely controlled fury: "Colm, you are ordered to respond to this transmission immediately." She keyed the radio twice but did not speak. Sound carried in mountains, and she was now close enough to Krieg's position that even whispers might be heard. "God damn it, Cole." Vaughn's professionalism was cracking. "If you're going after Krieg, you're committing suicide. That range is impossible. Wind is impossible. You'll reveal your position and accomplish nothing except drawing fire from every Black Ridge operator in these mountains." Sarah keyed the radio 3 times. The signal they had established meant, "I understand your concern. I am proceeding anyway. Do not attempt to interfere." Silence on the other end. Then quietly, Grizzly's voice: Your father made this shot in Kandahar. 4,180 meters, night conditions, sandstorm. I was his spotter. Took him one attempt. When they examined the body later, they found the bullet had entered through the target's left eye. Perfect shot. Impossible shot. The kind of shot that changes what people believe is possible. Sarah closed her eyes and absorbed the words. Not just the information, but the intention behind it. Grizzly was not questioning her ability, was not warning her about the risk. He was telling her that the shot could be made, that precedent existed, that impossibility was simply a limit that no one had exceeded yet. I believe in you, Sarah, Grizzly continued. But more than that, I believe in what your father taught you. Trust your instincts. And when you take the shot, don't doubt. Doubt kills. Certainty, even false certainty, is better than doubt. The transmission ended. Sarah opened her eyes and began her calculations. Environmental conditions. Temperature -28 Celsius at her position, estimated -40 at target elevation. Humidity 41% with active precipitation. Barometric pressure 23.1 inches of mercury and falling as the storm intensified. Wind. This was the variable that could not be calculated with precision. At the surface, gusts were reaching 55 miles per hour from the northwest. At mid-altitude, estimated 45 miles per hour from the west. At high altitude, where the bullet would spend most of its flight time, estimated 50 miles per hour from west-southwest. But these were approximations, educated guesses based on observation of snow patterns and cloud movement. The actual wind layers could be different, likely were different. Ballistic data. Her rifle, the Macmillan TAC-50, fired .50 BMG ammunition at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. The 750-grain bullet would drop approximately 195 feet over the distance. Time of flight, 15.8 seconds. Energy at target would be reduced to 1,800 foot-pounds, still lethal, but barely. Coriolis effect. At 47.6 degrees north latitude, the Earth's rotation would push the bullet 13.4 inches to the right. Spin drift. The right-hand twist of her barrel would add another 8.8 inches of rightward drift. Total mathematical solution. Hold approximately 52 feet high and 44 feet to the left to compensate for all known variables. But mathematics assumes stable conditions. Mathematics assume that her estimates of wind speed and direction were accurate. Mathematics assume that temperature variations along the bullet path were consistent with her predictions. And mathematics, Sarah knew from 3 years of making shots that should have missed, was only half the equation. The other half was instinct. She settled into her rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the stock against her shoulder, the familiar curve of the grip in her hand, the familiar cold of the scope against her eyebrow. She began to breathe. 4-count inhale through the nose, hold for 7, exhale for 8. The breathing technique her father had taught her when she was 12 years old, designed to drop heart rate and oxygenate blood and create the physiological state where fine motor control became possible. Her heart rate dropped. 70 beats per minute, 65, 60. She watched the wind patterns. Snow was moving across her field of view in waves, the flakes not falling straight down but traveling at angles that revealed wind direction and speed. She noted the rhythm. Gust for 15 seconds, lull for 8, gust for 12, lull for 6. Not perfectly regular, but close enough to predict. Through her scope, magnified 25 times, the thermal signature on Cathedral Peak was clearly visible. Man-sized, sitting position relatively stable, occasionally raising binoculars to scan the valley, then lowering them. The movements were so slight that anyone else might have missed them. Sarah cataloged each one, building a profile of Krieg's behavior patterns, predicting when he would be most still. Her radio crackled once more. Different frequency. Krieg's voice again, that same cultured emptiness. "I can see you, Sarah. Thermal signature halfway up the mountain, 200 meters below me. Did you really think you could climb Cathedral Peak without me noticing? I've had a spotter watching you for the last hour. I let you come because I wanted to see if you'd actually try this. Sarah's finger moved to her radio, switched it off. Whatever Krieg said now did not matter. He could be lying about seeing her, could be bluffing to make her doubt her position. Or he could be telling the truth, could have a rifle trained on her right now, waiting to fire the moment she committed to her shot. The only way to know was to force the issue. She returned to her scope. The thermal signature had shifted slightly, binoculars raised again. Krieg was scanning, searching. If he had truly seen her, he would not be searching. He would be aiming, which meant his spotter, if one existed, had only a general idea of her location, had seen thermal bloom during her climb, but lost track of her once she settled into this hide. Good. Let him search. Let him waste time and attention on finding a target that was about to find him. Her radio crackled one final time. Morrison's voice panicked. Sarah, thermal signatures moving toward your position. 3 contacts 200 meters below you, climbing fast. Black Ridge hadn't retreated entirely. They'd sent a hunter-killer team for her. She had 2 choices: abort the shot and defend herself in close quarters, or take the shot now, knowing she'd be defenseless during the 15-second flight time. Knowing that if she missed, she'd die on this mountain. Sarah switched her radio off. Trust the mountain, she whispered. Sarah's breathing slowed further. Heart rate touched 58 beats per minute. The world narrowed to the circle of her scope, to the crosshair centered on a thermal signature 4,100 meters distant. She made her final adjustments. Elevation. Compensate for 195 feet of drop. Windage. Hold 44 feet left against the estimated drift. But those were mathematical holds. Her instincts were telling her something different. The snow patterns were not moving left to right as strongly as her calculations suggested. The flakes were describing arcs that curved more than they translated, suggesting rotational wind, suggesting that the straight-line wind component was less than she had estimated. Maybe 35 miles per hour average instead of 45, which would reduce her windage hold to perhaps 38 feet. Her father's voice. When math and instinct conflict, trust instinct. Math is built on assumptions. Instinct is built on thousands of observations your conscious mind never registered. The mountain never lies. She adjusted her hold. 38 feet left, 52 feet high. Crosshair settled on empty air that seemed absurd as an aiming point, but felt correct in ways she could not articulate. The wind dropped. One of those momentary lulls that came between gusts, when the mountain took a breath before exhaling again. 5 seconds of relative calm, maybe 6 if she was lucky. Sarah's finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. 3.5 pounds of pressure required to break the shot. She applied it smoothly, steadily, without jerking or anticipating the recoil. The TAC-50 roared. The sound was enormous in the confined space between rocks, a physical force that slammed against her ears despite hearing protection. Recoil drove the rifle back against her shoulder with enough force to bruise despite proper positioning. She rode the recoil, came back down, stayed in her scope. Now came the longest 15 seconds of her life. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. A copper-jacketed projectile weighing as much as 3/4, carrying energy measured in thousands of foot-pounds. It flew through darkness and snow, through wind that pushed it and cold that slowed it, and the Earth's rotation that curved its path. It climbed through the first 1,000 meters, reaching apex around 2,000 meters, then began its long descent toward the target. Sarah counted. 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. Through her scope, she could not see the bullet, could not track its arc, could only watch the thermal signature and trust that 30 years of combined training between her and her father had produced the correct solution. 1,008, 1009, 1010. The thermal signature had not moved. Krieg was still sitting, still scanning with his binoculars, completely unaware that death was traveling toward him at a speed that made awareness irrelevant. 1013, 1014, 1015, nothing. The world held its breath. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system now that the shot was taken and control was surrendered to physics and fate. 1016. The sonic boom arrived, a distant crack that echoed off the mountain faces. It arrived late because sound traveled so much slower than bullets, because the report of her rifle took nearly 4 seconds to reach Krieg's position, while the bullet took only 15.8. Through her scope, she saw the thermal signature jerk, saw it fall sideways, saw the heat bloom suddenly expand as a body that had been sitting became a body that was lying down, bleeding, dying. She had hit him. At 4,187 meters, in a snowstorm, at night, with wind that should have made the shot impossible, she had put a .50 caliber bullet exactly where she intended. The shot would be recorded, if it was recorded at all, as the longest confirmed kill in United States military history. But records were irrelevant. Statistics were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was that Victor Krieg, the man who had executed Ghost 7, who had hunted her for 3 years, who had killed Frost and wounded Shaw and Steele, was dead. Her radio erupted with chatter. Black Ridge operators, suddenly leaderless, suddenly panicked. Wolf 1 is down. Krieg is hit. Where did that shot come from? And then, seconds later, the words that changed everything. Abort, abort, extraction protocol, we're falling back. Through her scope, Sarah watched as thermal signatures began to move. The 4 sniper positions she had marked earlier were suddenly evacuating. Men appeared from hides, moving rapidly down slope, no longer concerned with stealth or tactical positioning. They were running. 8 operators, maybe 9, sprinting toward extraction points that would take them out of these mountains and away from whoever had just killed their commander from an impossible distance. Sarah remained in position, tracking them until they disappeared beyond her scope's effective range. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to move. She stood slowly, joints protesting after hours of immobility in sub-freezing temperatures. Her hands shook, adrenaline and cold combining to make her fingers almost useless. She forced them to work, to secure her rifle, to pack her limited equipment. The climb down from Cathedral Peak was faster than the climb up, but infinitely more dangerous. Her legs felt like water. Her vision was tunneling from exhaustion and oxygen debt. Twice she slipped, caught herself at the last second, continued descending through darkness that was now complete. The storm had arrived fully, snow falling in sheets that reduced visibility to arm's length. 50 meters below the shooting position, she heard voices. Close, too close. 3 Black Ridge operators were ascending, moving with the confidence of men who believed their target was trapped above them. They hadn't heard the shot over the wind, didn't know Krieg was already dead. Sarah pressed herself into a crevice, controlling her breathing. They passed within 10 feet of her position, thermal signatures bright in her scope. She could kill all 3 with her sidearm, but gunfire would alert any remaining operators. She let them pass, let them climb toward a corpse, and continued her descent into the storm. She reached the base of the mountain at 0130 hours. The camp was 2 kilometers southeast, a distance that felt infinite. She forced herself to move, 1 foot in front of the other, falling into the rhythm of movement that required no thought, only endurance. At 0215, she saw lights, not the camp's generators but flashlights moving toward her. She dropped to one knee, raised her rifle despite exhaustion, prepared to fight if the lights belonged to Black Ridge operators who had circled back. "Cole!" Morrison's voice shouting over the wind. "Sarah Cole, if that's you, signal now." She raised one hand, waved it back and forth. The lights converged on her position. Suddenly, there were hands pulling her to her feet, voices asking if she was injured, if she could walk. She tried to respond but discovered that her jaw had locked from cold, that words were beyond her current capability. Strong arms supported her on both sides. Morrison on the left, Grizzly on the right. They half carried her back toward camp, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. Sarah's consciousness began to fragment, hypothermia and exhaustion creating gaps in awareness. She remembered reaching the command tent, remembered Vaughn's face, stern and relieved in equal measure. Remembered hot coffee forced between her lips, the liquid burning all the way down. Then she was on a cot, wrapped in thermal blankets, shaking so violently that her teeth clattered together. Vaughn sat beside her, waiting for the shaking to subside enough that conversation was possible. "You killed him," Vaughn said finally. It was not a question. Sarah nodded. 4,000 meters, in a storm, at night. Vaughn shook his head slowly. "Your father made a shot like that once. Only once. I didn't think it could be replicated." "Is he alive?" Sarah's voice was barely recognizable, a rasp that hurt to produce. "My father, is he alive?" Vaughn's face shifted, revealing something that might have been compassion or might have been pity. "Yes, he's alive. Has been for 6 years, working black operations that don't have names, hunting the people who ordered the Ghost 7 massacre. Then Krieg lied about my father hiring him. Krieg always lied. That was his signature. Break people psychologically before killing them physically. Your father didn't hire him. Your father has been trying to kill him for 3 years. We just got there first." Vaughn pulled a satellite phone from his pocket, handed it to her. "He's waiting. Has been waiting since I called him 2 hours ago to tell him you were attempting something suicidal." Sarah took the phone with hands that still shook, pressed it to her ear. "Father?" The voice that answered was rough with emotion barely controlled. "Sarah, Christ, Sarah. Grizzly radioed me, told me what you did. 4,187 meters, in conditions that should have made it impossible. Baby girl, I'm so proud I can barely form words." Sarah closed her eyes. Tears came, without permission, tracking down her cheeks. "You left me. For 3 years I thought you were dead." "I know." William Cole's voice broke slightly. "And I'm sorry. I was hunting Alexander Torrance, deputy director of JSOC. He's the one who sold Ghost 7 to the Chechens. He's the one who hired Krieg to eliminate evidence. You were never supposed to survive, Sarah. When I learned you had, I couldn't contact you, couldn't risk leading them to you. The only way to protect you was to hunt them from the shadows while you stayed invisible." "I'm not invisible anymore." "No, you're legendary. And that's better. Legends are protected. Ghosts are hunted. You just announced to every intelligence service in the world that Sarah Cole is the finest sniper alive. They'll want you now. Delta, CIA, half a dozen other agencies. You'll have choices, protection, resources." Sarah was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "Is Torrance dead?" "As of 20 minutes ago, yes. CIA custody, Langley. They're debriefing me now. I'll be officially alive again in approximately 2 weeks. After which, if you want, we can meet. Arlington National Cemetery, your mother's grave, like we used to." "I'd like that." "Sarah," her father's voice softened, "you did something tonight that maybe 5 people in human history could do. You made an impossible shot. You saved your team. You killed the man who murdered your brothers and sisters in Ghost 7. You honor their memory, and you honor me. And I need you to know, I love you. Never doubted it, never stopped, not for 1 second in 3 years." Sarah could not speak, could only hold the phone and let the words settle into places that had been empty for so long that she had forgotten they existed. "Come home, Sarah," her father said. "Rest, heal, and then we'll see what comes next. Together this time. No more shadows, No more running. We finished this fight side by side. The call ended. Sarah handed the phone back to Vaughn and lay back on the cot. Through the tent opening, she could see the storm raging, snow falling so heavily that visibility was measured in feet. The language of stone and wind and snow was speaking again, telling everyone to find shelter, to wait, to survive until morning brought clarity. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion claim her. When she woke, it was 0800 hours. The storm had passed. Sunlight, brilliant and cold, streamed through the tent entrance. She sat up slowly, discovering that her body had cataloged every bruise, every strain, every moment of abuse from the previous night. She felt like she had been beaten systematically for hours. Outside, voices. She dressed in clean thermal gear, stepped into the morning light. The camp had been transformed. Where there had been tension and fear, there was now something closer to celebration. Morrison was helping Shaw with physical therapy exercises, the wounded man's arm in a sling, but mobile. Werner Steele limped past on crutches, his leg bandaged, but healing. Rowan Caldwell was laughing at something Beaumont Shaw had said. Thaddeus Blackwell stood at the edge of the camp, looking toward Cathedral Peak, a small smile on his weathered face. Colonel Vaughn intercepted her before she could speak to anyone else. Medevac arrives in 30 minutes. Shaw and Steele are being transported to base medical for proper treatment. The rest of us extract at 1000 hours. You're coming with us. Yes, sir. The Army is going to want to debrief you extensively. That shot last night, officially it never happened. Unofficially, you just became the most valuable sniper asset in the United States military. Expect offers from Delta, from SOCOM, probably from agencies that don't officially exist. You'll have choices. Sarah looked past him toward the mountains. I already know what I'm choosing. I want to train the next generation. Want to teach what my father taught me, that records are just numbers, but skill saves lives. That mathematics matter, but instinct matters more. That sometimes the only way to survive is to attempt something so impossible that no one believes you'd try it. Vaughn studied her face, then nodded. I'll make the recommendations. Delta Force instructor, Sniper Division. You'll have a class of 20, all candidates who think they're the best. Your job will be teaching them they're not. Not yet. Yes, sir. Morrison approached, hesitant in a way that suggested he had been working up courage for this conversation. Cole, Sarah, I owe you an apology. My communication failure got Frost killed, got Shaw and Steele wounded, should have gotten all of us killed. You saved us despite that, despite me. Sarah met his eyes directly. You made a mistake. In this work, mistakes cost lives. You'll carry that. But you also stayed and fought when running would have been easier. That counts. Morrison extended his hand. After a moment, Sarah shook it. Grizzly was the last to approach. The old sniper moved slowly, age and arthritis making each step deliberate. He stopped in front of Sarah and for a long moment simply looked at her with eyes that had seen 50 years of war. Your father is going to tell you about Kandahar, Grizzly said quietly. About the 4,000-meter shot that everyone said was impossible. But I'll tell you something he won't. That shot took him 3 attempts. 3 nights of climbing that mountain, of setting up, of taking the shot and missing. He got it on the 3rd night, and when he did, he came down from that mountain and he cried. Not from relief, not from exhaustion, from the knowledge that he'd reached his ceiling, that he'd made the best shot he would ever make. Grizzly paused, his voice taking on weight. Last night, Sarah, you made that shot on your first attempt. In worse conditions than he had, at a greater distance. You didn't just match your father, you exceeded him. And that's important because the next generation needs to know that ceilings are just limits no one has broken yet. Sarah felt her throat tighten. He taught me everything. He taught you the foundation. You built the rest yourself. In 3 years of running, of surviving, of refusing to surrender, That's not his legacy. That's yours. The medevac helicopter arrived at 0830, a thunderous presence that scattered snow and made conversation impossible. Shaw was loaded carefully, his shoulder stabilized but still requiring surgical repair. Steele went with him, his leg wound deemed sufficient to justify extraction, despite his protests. At 1000 hours, the remaining Iron Wolves began breaking camp. Equipment was packed, positions were dismantled, the temporary fortress was erased from the landscape as thoroughly as possible. By 1100, 4 helicopters had arrived to extract personnel and equipment. By noon, the valley was empty except for boot prints and shell casings and 3 small crosses made from rifle cleaning rods, placed where Frost had died. Sarah was the last to board her helicopter. She stood at the edge of the landing zone, looking back at the mountains that had nearly killed her, that had tested her, that had witnessed her transformation from ghost to legend. Cathedral Peak rose in the distance, snow-covered and silent, keeping its secrets. She had learned that her father's voice was not the only wisdom worth hearing, that sometimes you had to read the language of stone and wind and snow in whispers only you could understand, that the difference between impossible and legendary was nothing more than attempting what everyone else feared to try. She climbed into the helicopter. The rotors spun up, the aircraft lifted, the valley dropped away beneath them. Sarah watched until the mountains disappeared into distance and cloud, then turned forward toward whatever came next. 6 months later, she stood in Arlington National Cemetery, wearing dress uniform that still felt foreign despite weeks of acclimation. The graves before her were marked with simple stones, Callum Frost, and 8 names from Ghost 7 that she had carried for 3 years. Flowers lay at the base of each stone, placed there minutes before. Behind her, a presence she had not felt in 3 years. She turned. General William Cole stood 10 feet away, 60 years old, gray beard trimmed military precise, eyes the same shade as hers. He was thinner than she remembered, harder, carrying the weight of 6 years in shadows that had no names. But he was alive, and he was here. They stood looking at each other for 5 seconds that contained 3 years of absence, of grief, of questions that could not be asked over encrypted phones. Then Sarah closed the distance, and her father's arms wrapped around her, and she was 9 years old again, safe and certain that nothing could harm her while he was present. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, "for every day I couldn't be there, for every moment you thought you were alone. I'm sorry, Sarah." "I know," she said, and she did. They stood at the graves together, father and daughter, 2 snipers who had both made impossible shots, who had both paid prices that civilians would never understand. The morning sun warmed the stones. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler played taps for a funeral neither of them knew. "They want you at Bragg," her father said finally. "Instructor position. 20 candidates per class, all special forces qualified, all convinced they're the best. I accepted last week." "Good. You'll break them. Build them back better. That's the work that matters." He paused. "I'll be there too. Advisory role, technically retired, but they asked me to consult. We'll be working in the same building." Sarah smiled slightly. "Think you can keep up with me, old man?" William Cole laughed, a sound she had not heard in years. "Not a chance, but I'll enjoy watching you set standards I could never match." They stayed until the sun climbed high, until duty called them back to the work that never ended. As they walked toward the parking area, Sarah noticed Morrison and Grizzly standing at a respectful distance, waiting. Morrison caught her eye and nodded once. He wore the insignia of captain now, his promotion coming 3 months after the Cascade incident. The guilt over Frost's death would never fully fade. Sarah could see it in the way his jaw tightened when he looked at the graves. But he had learned to carry it, to let it make him better rather than break him. Grizzly stood beside Morrison, leaning slightly on a cane he hadn't needed 6 months ago. Age was claiming him faster now, but his eyes were clear, satisfied. He had trained his last recruit, had watched her exceed not just his record, but every ceiling the old guard had believed unbreakable. His work was complete. "You ready?" her father asked quietly. Sarah looked at the graves one final time, at the names carved in stone, at the brothers and sisters she had carried for 3 years, who could finally rest now that Krieg was dead and Torrance was in chains. "I'm ready," she said. Her team now, her brothers, forged not in blood relation but in shared combat, in trust earned through impossible circumstances. She had learned many things in these mountains, but perhaps the most important was this: ghosts could become legends, survivors could become instructors, and impossibility was just another word for a ceiling no one had broken yet. Sarah Cole had broken through, and she would spend the rest of her life teaching others to do the same. The story ended where it began, in mountains that did not care about human ambition, that would stand long after all the snipers and soldiers and legends had returned to dust. But for now, in this moment, the mountains held a new record, a new story, a new truth. 4,187 meters, one woman, one shot, one night when the impossible became simply what happened, when courage met skill, and neither blinked first. The rest was history, the kind that would be whispered about in sniper schools for generations, the kind that changed what people believed humans could do, the kind that proved, once and for all, that Sarah Cole was not her father's shadow. She was the light that would guide others through their own darkness. And that was legacy enough.